I'm Alan Wardis, and you're listening to Think Radio.
You know, when you dabble into journalism, if you dabble long enough, you're going to get deeper and deeper into what happened to make what's happening now happen.
That's George Sibley, storyteller, writer, teacher, and philosopher. We sat down recently to talk about his life in the Gunnison Valley and what it means to live at the headwaters. You won't want to miss the conversation on this episode of Think Radio.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by the Western State Colorado University Office of Academic Affairs. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a Think Radio patron, visit alanwardesmedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
George, thanks for joining me today. I'm really thrilled to have you in the studio.
Thanks, Alan. Nice to be here.
Yeah, you know, the thing about being George Sibley, you've been around so long and have had your hands in so many things, and I'm just really excited for this conversation to back all the way up to the beginning and start off with the question, how'd you get here at all? Why here? Where'd you come from?
Where did I come from? I came here in 1966, a year after I'd been evicted from the United States Army, and I was in what I felt was full and semi-disorderly retreat from civilization, and hoped I'd find that without leaving behind everything involved in civilization, you know, all the stuff I had in the trunk of my car, for example. I was at loose ends. I had started skiing when I was in the Army at Fort Carson, Colorado, down by Colorado Springs, and since I didn't have a future anyway, that was what they told us. If you get kicked out of the Army, you don't have any kind of a future at all in America.
Okay, so let's stop right there.
Okay.
What could you have done to get kicked out of the United States Army?
I told them that I didn't want to be an officer in the Army that was doing what it was doing in Vietnam, that I would rather be converted to an enlisted man to finish out my time. And what they decided was that I was probably crazy and gave me a medical discharge.
Because clearly that is not the position of a sane person.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I was probably lucky in a way because if I had persisted in something, I'd probably have spent some time in jail. And
yeah, so were you an officer already? And so you were basically relinquishing your commission.
I went through the ROTC thing in college in Pittsburgh because I had been ill-advised that I would probably be better off in the military as an officer than as an enlisted man, which I realized I simply wasn't officer material. I didn't want to be conveying orders to people, and I would much rather have been in the motor pool, which looked like a great place to be because I would have learned something useful.
Well, so conscientious objection once you're in is a lot harder to do.
Yeah, it is. And fundamentally, after I made my foolish statement, they sent me to sort of a good cop, bad cop team of psychiatrists who passed me back and forth for a day or so, and they concluded that I was basically masochistic in my nature and that I probably wasn't suited for the military and that they should just ease me out. So they eased me out. And I was content with that. I didn't want to spend time in jail on principled stand.
You just wanted to take it.
I took the easy way out.
Well, easy.
Let them think I'm crazy.
Easier.
Yeah.
Well, and that was 1966?
It was 1965 that I...
Yeah, and so then history in the next...
I worked at a ski area that winter, just mopping floors and in exchange for a place to stay at Loveland Ski Area, and spent the winter there. And then I spent a winter or summer doing construction in Denver, and then wanted to go back to the mountains for the winter and ski again. And I did get a job in Aspen, and the only place I could find to live was a 18-foot trailer down in Woody Creek, and it wasn't ideal. And then I read in the newspaper that Crested Butte had resolved its bankruptcy problems and was going to be open for the winter. This is the middle of November. They were just deciding in the middle of November that they were going to be open for the winter.
Those were the days.
But, yeah. So I thought, well, what the heck? Went over to Crested Butte. My only effort towards the future, the first winter I was out, was I took a first aid course, because that was all you needed at that time to be on a ski patrol. And I thought, well, I'd like to be on a ski patrol. I had 1 year of skiing behind me. I went to Crested Butte and said I interviewed for the ski patrol, and they hired me on the spot. They didn't even ask me if I could ski.
But you could start like tomorrow, so that was good enough for them.
Yeah. I found out later that people hadn't wanted to work for Crested Butte because the year before, people had not gotten paid towards the end of the season. And so everybody thought, well, they're really shaky. And
yeah, that might dampen your enthusiasm a little bit.
Yeah. But I got paid every month, and I learned how to ski well enough to not embarrass myself too often, skiing up to an accident and having a toboggan run over me or something. But I only did that once.
Oh, well, okay, good. You learned that lesson out of the way.
But that was how I got to Crested Butte. And
well, and still with this idea in mind of getting some distance between you and civilization?
Yeah, I just didn't want to have anything to do with the America that was doing Vietnam, basically. And
why not, precisely? I mean, a lot of people made choices like that. What was in your mind when you were thinking that?
I didn't feel there was anything I could do about it, and yet I couldn't go along with it. So I wanted to go someplace in the third world, and Crested Butte was as close.
Well, it kind of was. It still is in some ways.
Yeah. There were days that winter that when they had absolutely no publicity for the ski season, that the ski patrol, 7 of us, outnumbered the skiers on the hill. So
everyone was very safe that day.
Yeah, we followed them all down the hill and lurked behind them. But yeah, so it was a pretty quiet town that winter, but it was really interesting. And it was because there were still a lot of the people who'd grown up in Crested Butte, and they were all, they were either the sons of immigrants or they themselves were immigrants.
Particularly miners.
Yeah, they were miners. And they all came out every day. They talked to us. If we would listen to their stories, they tolerated us. It was the first place I'd ever been in my life where I felt like I understood what community was.
So you grew up in Pittsburgh.
I grew up in north of Pittsburgh, a little industrial town.
So a lot of people will say, well, I had community and I lived in a block in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
But you didn't feel that way. Why not?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I think it simply wasn't in the culture somehow.
What were those aspects that you looked at and said, that's community?
The $1.29 dinner special at the Grub Steak restaurant, where everybody that was single and unattached in some way, including the old-timers that were, there was sort of the equivalent of Norwegian bachelor farmers in Lake Wobegon, a lot of them. Everybody went to the Grub Steak and ate the $1.29 special. I'm sure that the Grub Steak thought, well, this this is sort of a lost leader. We'll get him in here, and they'll have a beer, and then they'll be around for the evening. And
But the point really wasn't the food.
no, it was the company. We were all there, and there were not that many of us. It was the size as much as anything, I guess. And everybody was poor. There was no big money floating around the town at that time, and we were all sort of in the same boat. My car broke down as I was driving there. I had to borrow a car to go over and get my stuff out of the car in Buena Vista. It was a real bald tire culture.
Ball tower culture. I've lived in some of those.
Yeah.
You bring up an interesting point that if everybody in the community is in the same boat, then you're not looking across the street at somebody who's in a radically different position. What does that do to foster community also?
It does a lot, I think. We can talk all we want about diversity. We had some diversity there because we had people that hadn't spoken the language really until they were in their teens, and we were from all over the place. There was not what you'd call racial diversity, but the economic lack of diversity was good for community. The fact that we were all sort of in the same boat there, and I think that's in American culture at any rate, where you're measured to a certain extent by what you have. If nobody has much, it's a much more comfortable environment than if you're across the street from people who have quite a lot, or at least quite a bit more than you do.
Yeah, because it's accurate to say that you are often measured by what you have or don't have. Maybe even the more pernicious thing is you begin to measure yourself according to those metrics.
Yeah.
If it's not in your face, then you're not as inclined to do that.
Yeah.
Huh, very interesting. At what point did you look around then? We're still, I guess, in that first year where you're brand new to the ski patrol, brand new to this little community. You're sitting there at the grub stake. At what point did you look around and think, I could actually stay here?
I left for the summer. I left at the end of the ski season. I was with a woman who had a job back in, she was a nurse, and she had a job back in Chicago where she was from. So we took a month and went to Mexico right after the ski area closed, and then went up to Chicago. And then I went on to a job in Boston working for a fellow I'd worked for at the University of Pittsburgh when I was in college, doing stage work, theater work, and building sets, that kind of thing. But I decided to go back to Crested Butte. They said, if you want to come back, do. And I called up to see if they could put me to work in September. They could. A lot of stuff to do on the mountain, so I came back in September, and I'd seen it only in the winter before, November through April, and never a minute of that when it was not under snow, quite a bit of snow. And the place was just absolutely stunning that year, September and on into October. The weather was beautiful, clear Crested Butte days, and the leaves were incredible. Just Don Bachman, the patrol leader, was also around, and we were both working on the mountain, just doing stuff, blowing up stumps and rocks, and cutting down brush, and making the ski trails a little smoother. And we go downtown for lunch and have a burger and a couple beers at some place or another, and then back to work in the afternoon. And I just remember driving up towards the ski area one day and seeing this dust devil go through a stand of aspen up on the side of Snodgrass up there, and just this whirl of golden leaves going up on a ski lift tower working on the telephone cable, and a bear walks by underneath us. And you just looking up in the morning at 10 o'clock, and you could see Venus. It was that clear. You could see the morning star.
So a long way from North Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
A long way from Boston.
It just captured me, and I don't care if I ever leave this place again. And at that point, I didn't.
Yeah, more or less, that's what you did.
That was my second winter on the ski patrol, and we had a little falling out with management that year, and they fired the patrol leader for having a party on the closing day, and I quit too in disgust. But I also sitting around the bar with a number of people, including the patrol leader, but also Dr. Art Norris from Western State College, who was living up there. He was married to a Swiss woman, and when he got the job at Western, she said, "I'll only come if we can live up in the mountains." And so they were living in Crested Butte, and we got very involved in thinking about what's going to happen here. What's the future of this place? What is it going to just become another Aspen? Because at that point, they'd survived that bad year, and people had started coming anyway towards the end of the ski season, and it looked like the place had bottomed out kind of, and was maybe on the upswing. And so what do we want to have happen here? And one of the things that Dr. Norris thought should happen, we need a newspaper. And
a pillar of civilization.
Yeah.
Civilization followed you, George.
Well,
and you were there.
You're getting ahead of me here, but yeah, it's true. I did end up thinking, but I said, well, I've always wanted to be a writer, and said, okay, you're going to be a writer. We're going to buy the Chronicle back from Fred Booty down in Gunnison, who had inherited the paper for lack of payment on his bills for printing the paper. And so we went to talk to Fred Booty, and he said $3,000. And said, ooh, wow. Well, I didn't have anything like that, but
today that sounds like chump change, but in 1967 or whenever this
was. It
was
a little more. I was making $300 a month as a ski patrolman, so we went down the street to the Oasis to have a beer and some lunch and think it through, and he says, let's go back and tell him that he's paying to put out the paper himself now. So if he had somebody that was going to take a printing contract out with him to do the newspaper, so he'd be getting paid for the newspaper, then maybe we could talk that price down. And he said, my suggestion is we offer him a 6-month printing contract and $1. And so we went back and talked to Fred, and well, okay. Art said, you'll probably get it back in 6 months anyway, and then somebody might come along who wants.
So did either of you have any experience in the newspaper business?
No, nothing. I had no journalistic training in college. I had freshman composition, and
yeah, so you might as well have been loading things up in a covered wagon and heading west for all you knew about how to run this business.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yes, exactly.
So I'm very curious, from your perspective, what did the first issue look like? What was in it?
What was in it was a picture on the front page of Pitsker Sporsich leading the color guard back from the cemetery where they'd marched out. There were only 4 in the color guard.
Memorial
plus
Day
Pitsker
or something like that?
Memorial Day.
Mm-hmm.
It was the first issue in June, and it was right after Memorial Day, and so it had a picture of Pitsker on the front page, and then a people story about Pitsker inside, which everybody really liked. And I think the news was that their town council was going to be meeting and holding an open meeting, and I had no knowledge about things like a 30-word lead for news stories and that you shouldn't editorialize in your news stories.
Well, when you buy the paper for a 6-month contract and $1,
yeah,
you can break the rules a little bit.
It was basically a cheerleader newspaper, a booster paper for the Crested Butte of the future. And
well, but you and Art had already been thinking about what that vision should be. So when you say it was a booster paper, what was that vision? In what direction were you and Art wanting to push things?
Well, we kept articulating the vision, but what we thought was there were two things going on in that end of the valley that we thought were really, really good as complements to a ski industry. And one was the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory.
Which was pretty new at that point, right?
It wasn't. It had been there since 1928.
Ah, okay.
So it had been there for a while. There was not much interaction between the town and the lab because the founder of the lab he had a tax-free status as an educational institution, and he didn't want anybody in the valley thinking that people were coming there because they wanted to spend their summers in the
no, it was
beautiful place.
It was about hard work.
It was hard work
all the time.
All the time, and so but they were here, and then there was Dr. Hubert Winston Smith's Law Science Academy, which was for forensic medicine. It was an effort by the man who had been Jack Ruby's lawyer back in Oklahoma and in Texas, had bought up a lot of property in Crested Butte, and in around 1952 he started the Law Science Academy, and it was to bring together doctors and scientists and lawyers to try to bring some order to the business of taking medical issues into the courtroom, to try to get some science to the decisions that were made about.
Well, so it also has to be pointed out that they were doing this in a really nice place, right? Why pick Crested Butte for something like that?
Because he had come here with somebody from Jack Johnson, I think, from Oklahoma, and way back before the ski area even started, and he thought it was a beautiful spot and realized that this was when the mine had just closed, and there were people that literally were selling houses for maybe $100, enough money to get out of town. And he bought a lot of houses, and he did not endear himself to the local population through that. But it really worked out well for the community because he was here in the summer and needed those homes for the people he was bringing in, to the doctors and scientists and such like, to stay in. And that left them empty during the winter, so he hired Rudy Sedmak to manage them for him and rented them out in the winter after the ski area started to skiers and ski patrolmen and such like. I lived in a Smith house the first.
So short-term rentals have been around for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. These were like, you could rent it for the 7 or 8 months of the that the he didn't need it for the Law Science Academy, and you could rent a room in the Academy Arms, which is now the Forest Queen Hotel, for $30 a month.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can join the Think Radio community of patrons, visit alanwartesmedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
And so at the newspaper, then, you guys looked at these two things, the rumble.
This is a better future for the valley than just becoming a recreation spa for rich people to come to. And
with some economic diversity.
Yeah, and so we thought, there are probably other ways in which this kind of thing, and it happened that the summer of '67, a University of Kansas art professor, had brought a class of I think it was a painting class, I'm not sure, a class of people through, and they spent the afternoon on the back deck of a retired Marine Colonel, Gene Martin, who thought he was another guy like Art Norris, who always was thinking of things for the future of this town. And he thought, I'll bet there's a lot of classes out there that would like to come here as a destination and have a class here for 2 weeks or a month or whatever. And he stayed in touch with this guy from the University of Kansas, and the guy said, we could probably get some art classes out there for the summer. And so that was, we needed a place to do that. And there was the Old Rock Schoolhouse there, which is now the library.
Mm-hmm.
But it was empty, abandoned. It was decrepit and falling apart. It needed a new roof. But Gene and Dr. Norris went and talked to the school district. They said, we'd lease that to you for $1 a year if you'll do some work on it and try to save the building. And that would, you could use the school grounds then for these art classes that you're talking about wanting to bring in. And we'll even let you lease rooms in the schoolhouse itself. And so all of a sudden we had a campus in town for bringing groups in for the summer. And in the winter the school was using the classes, but we could use it all summer. And that fall of '67, this was before we bought the newspaper, but that fall we had a work session to put a new roof on the old school. And that was, I think that was probably where I started to put things together about what a community was, and all these people turned out to help with that. Some of them who even actually knew what they were doing and knew how to put tin on a roof. And so we worked all day. Nobody fell off the roof. Remember at lunchtime, it was the first year that students were moving up to Crested Butte from the college before the ski season started. And this was the summer of love, right? '67.
Well, I was about to point that out and ask you, was that trend, were those currents being felt in the valley as well?
Yes, very definitely. We had hippies.
Did you consider yourself one of them?
I was a little old for them, and I didn't have a beard, and I kept my hair trimmed because I was still trying to pretend to lay low. But at any rate, we did have a lot of young people in the valley that were really into being there, and it was kind of the autumn of love in Crested Butte in a way. Because,
And what did that look like?
Huh?
What did that look like? Were there, I don't know.
Well, you could say, what did it look like? What did it smell like?
What did it smell like? What did it sound like?
There were distinct new odors in the air that fall.
But camps of people out on public lands and that sort of thing, or?
They were able to get places to live in town. You know, you could you could rent a Dr. Smith house for $100 a month, and
wow, those days are gone.
Yeah, those days they went fast too.
That was a time. And the word that keeps coming to my mind is just opportunity. Seemed to be everywhere you turned.
Mm-hmm.
You could get a newspaper for not much.
Yeah,
you could get a campus for your classes for $1 a year.
Yeah, you could do all these things because you didn't know what you were doing, and anybody who knew what they were doing wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole. Now, who'd want to buy a 4-page newspaper in a place that had just come out of bankruptcy and et cetera? You know, I mean, it was well, somebody who didn't know what they were doing would be interested in that, and that was me. But
that kind of crazy sometimes pays off.
Yeah.
So what were the next few years like at the newspaper?
Well, I turned out to be a terrible businessman. I don't even apologize for it anymore, but I just it's not in my interactions with money have never been one of my strong suits, and I hated to sell advertising. I remember coming down to Gunnison to sell ads and going to Ross Blackstock at Blackstock's Pharmacy and asking him if he would like to have an ad in the newspaper. He says, "Why would I want to do that?" And well, I'm not sure. I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah.
And laughed. And I if people came around and wanted to put an ad in the paper, I was glad to do it. But my final accommodation with the newspaper was if the newspaper will take care of itself with enough ads to pay for the printing, I'll get a job and take care of myself as an alternative to, so I started working construction part-time for...
And also writing, still though?
Yeah. But not making anything on that other... I mean, almost all of my writing was the Chronicle, and only the Skiers Gazette, which was a sort of a regional skiers magazine out of Denver, started reprinting a couple of my things every now and then, and so I was able to start writing for them after I sold the newspaper. But I only did the newspaper for like 3.5 years about. But it was an interesting 3.5 years because I don't know, one thing that you realize about writing a newspaper is you can wait for things to happen to write about, or you can get involved in making things happen to write about. And so...
Okay, you're going to have to give me an example of what you mean by that.
Well, the Flushing Festival every spring. The end of winter in with Spring Festival that we'll be having the 50th one this year. And the first one was in the spring of '69, after I'd been doing the newspaper for about a year and realized that writing about this or that ski club coming to town, they all sounded the same after a while. And so we were Dr. Norris again, sitting around in the bar one night again with the usual suspects, and thinking, the ski season just sort of ends with a whimper around here rather than a bang, and it ought to end with a bang. I mean, you look at what we've done. We've put together a 5-month party for people to come and enjoy themselves. And when they all leave, we just all leave too and slink off to Mexico or Montrose or someplace warmer. And
Last one out, turn out the lights.
yeah. So said we need to have an end of winter festival, and it'll be just for us, not for the tourists. It'll be our celebration of what we've done.
So are you
right
the
at
father
end.
of naked skiing, George?
No.
Was that your idea?
No, that was not my idea. That was
I mean, it sounds like it could be part of this party that you're
it
talking
was
about.
John Burns' idea, actually. He was a fellow ski patrolman, and he was the first one to drop his drawers and ski down on the last run of the day. He also fell down. And I don't want to describe the...
On the very first trip down, drawerless,
Yeah.
he fell.
Yeah. It was best not to have had too big of a party up on top of the mountain.
I see. So this big bash
If you're
at the
going
end
to
of the
take
season.
your pants down and ski. But, yeah, but the Flushing Festival was one that was basically started by the newspaper having finally something interesting and fun to write about. And a lot of other things started somewhat the same way. The Arts Festival in the Summer Arts Festival. Some of the things that an organization called the Crested Butte Society, which was the nonprofit put together to manage this campus for summer art classes, and we did have some. It turned out to be a little too much to be handled on a volunteer basis. I mean, there was things like a sculpture class, and Gene Martin promises them, well, we'll have some marble for you to work on. That meant going over and fishing it out of the Crystal River where they used it, marble chunks for riprap.
And bringing it back over the pass.
Bringing it back over the pass. And after Gene threw his back out doing that, and fundamentally it became too much to try to do too many art classes during the summer. But we did try to keep that kind of going. And the newspaper played a big role in publicizing that and getting the word out about it. The newspaper was instrumental in getting the Mountain Theater going. In '72, it was after I'd left, but
so
I was writing stories for it still. And
you're listing off a lot of things that would fall into the category of cultural amenities. You know, festivals and art classes and so forth. What were the serious issues that were starting to pop up on your mind? Because your career since then, you've thought a lot and you've written a lot about some of the really important trends of becoming a community under these circumstances. At the Headwaters, for instance, we'll talk about the Headwaters Conference in a minute, but at what point did you start to become aware of these bigger macroeconomic and social issues that were coming to bear?
Well, doing the newspaper, when you dabble into journalism, if you dabble long enough, you're going to get deeper and deeper into what happened to make what's happening now happen. Fundamentally, we realized, I guess, that 1970 was a kind of a watershed year in Crested Butte, because that was the year that all of a sudden we were inundated by new young people who were just people like ourselves, but there were all of a sudden too many of them. And the old-timers that had taught us community, they kind of withdrew, and they created a senior center for themselves and stopped hanging out in the bars because the bars were full of strange hippies. And I remember doing a series in the paper where I got other people in the town to write under the same headline, "Welcome, stranger, please don't tread on the town." And
Oh boy.
and it was just kind of saying, we're glad you're here, but please respect the place and stop, look, and listen before you decide you have the answer for everything that's going on here. And this isn't like the rest of the world that you left behind, so don't judge us that way. And it's kind of
So going on 50 years ago,
mm-hmm.
you were having the same conversation with visitors that the communities today having with visitors.
Mm-hmm.
We've got Mountain Matters, we've got
Yep.
all sorts of efforts underway to do exactly what you're describing.
Mm-hmm.
That's one good reason to go back and read the newspaper archives once in a while. Because you get this idea that, oh, wait, there's nothing new going on, really. But on the other hand, let's fast forward to today.
Okay.
You've been involved with a lot of the sort of high-level thinking about how a community becomes what it is, and how to steer that process. What is different today than it was then? We just said some of the same issues are there.
Yeah.
What are the things that are different in the landscape that you see?
Well, the environment hadn't been invented yet when I came to Crested Butte, 1960.
That was pre-first Earth Day.
Yeah. By 1966 when I got here, we had a Wilderness Act. I guess we had the first iteration of the Endangered Species Act in 66. And so people were starting to wake up a little bit. But John Hahn up at the Forest Queen Mine in Irwin, he was a school janitor in Boulder who had somehow inherited the Forest Queen Mine through his family. And he came out every summer, and he was determined that he was going to reopen the Forest Queen Mine. And he was going to do this because the mine was flooded. And it had been a very rich mine, and he said there's still a lot of good stuff there. And he says, well, the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to dig a tunnel into the bottom and
drain the water into the creek.
Yeah, that's kind of cool, John. That's
yeah.
And some of the miners would go up and work with him on weekends, and we weren't thinking about
what that would do to the water supply.
Yeah, that whole thing probably would have washed out half the town if it had all come at once, but and it would have destroyed the river all the way down probably to Blue Mesa.
With heavy metals and so forth. Kind of Wild West.
Yeah. What's different is we're thinking about this stuff now, and this is important. People just weren't thinking about the world in the same way that we've started to. I mean, climate change was clearly happening, but we weren't thinking about it.
No.
Very few people were. It's interesting when you start going back into the history, how long ago people were saying, if we burn all this carbon stuff, we're going to be putting a lot of gases into the atmosphere that probably hold heat. And
yeah, it came on like it was breaking news in the first decade of the 21st century, but it really wasn't.
No, it was, yeah.
When you look at how the valley's communities are managed, what's the biggest change that you've seen over that span of time that you've been here?
Well, the housing problem has gotten worse. The housing problem started getting bad really in the early 70s. But we were, I was writing a lot of editorials about that and about the challenge of where we're going to put the people we need to work in the community. And
the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
We tell ourselves that. And yet it's not just a racetrack.
No.
There is a progression. As you've watched the progression through the decades, what are the things that have changed fundamentally about living here?
It's definitely harder to get started here. It's harder if you're coming here as I came here with next to nothing, a beat up old car and a trunk full of, you know, record player and
Yeah, nobody's going to lease you anything now for $1 a year.
No. I think that's probably the main change, is that it's just not as welcoming a place in the sense of you can fit in pretty easily and start fulfilling your heart's dreams.
Right. The word we used earlier was this was kind of a land of opportunity
Mm-hmm.
in those days. It's not quite so much anymore.
No, it isn't. And it has increasingly the kind of economic diversity that is not conducive to community. So money's playing a bigger role in the valley than it did when I was first here, because there wasn't any money.
Yeah. I'm trying to picture the last time I saw $1.29 for a dinner.
Yeah, I know.
Or anything
Yeah,
even
well,
remotely like
yeah,
it.
Yeah.
So we're almost out of time, but I have two remaining questions for you. And the first one is, we've done a lot of looking backward.
Mm-hmm.
As you look forward, what worries you the most about trends that you see for the future of this community?
Well, I think pressure on water is a big one. We're part of the Colorado River. We're the headwaters of the Colorado River. The river doesn't go to the ocean anymore. It goes to the desert. But we have obligations, and moral, if not legal. We've got legal obligations too. But
Well, in an era when climate change projections suggest
are going to
that we're going to have less water in general anyway.
Yeah, we're going to have less water, and that's going to mean more pressure from outside the basin or outside the Upper Gunnison on the water in the Upper Gunnison, and that may not make that much of a difference to, in fact, if we have to send more of the water downstream, it's going to help the people that like to float on that water, and maybe the people that like to fish in that water, and it's not going to help the ranchers who are the right holders for the use of that water. But that's what we're working on, this planning process, to try to figure out how to anticipate and deal with. But I think that's a thing that is worrisome. Where we're going to put the people that we need to keep the economy going, I think is going to become a worse problem before it's going to become resolved. We talk about big things like the Brush Creek corner, but that's not an ideal solution, even though it would help. We put an apartment in the garage at our place because we felt we could use the income, but also it's a place for one person to live relatively affordably.
Mm-hmm.
That I think makes it a better neighborhood, because we've got one young person, single and attached. He can't get outrageous because A, the place is too small, and B, the landlord lives next door. And I think if every home in the R1 and R2 districts in Gunnison had an alley house behind it, we would make big inroads on the affordable housing problem, and we'd have a more interesting community. It'd be much better if we could figure out ways to spread these people more into the smaller apartment units in the community, but you got to get somebody to build them, and
That's the big trick.
yeah.
Well, one thing's for
but-
certain that has become clear is it's not a simple problem. There are no simple answers.
Yeah, no. But
Well, so
it's-
here's my final
it's a-
question for you. As you look forward, what are you most hopeful about when you look at the future of this valley? What is the thing that gives you a reason to smile and you're like, okay, that looks good?
Well, I think fundamentally, I really like most of the people I know around here, and I think most of them are good-hearted people. And I don't think we, as a rule, think enough about the things like this that we're talking about. But we're the problem and the solution, and most of us are better than we give ourselves credit for being, and are capable of doing a lot more than we are doing in terms of really making it a more livable community. Maybe we need to look at how we are constructed as a community. We want a vibrant downtown, but we don't want to make it easier for people to live close to town or in town, in the downtown area even. And those are things that would make it more vibrant, I think. And vibrancy is a function of having people out and about and looking intelligently at the world they live in, and seeing problems and thinking about them and talking about them with other people, and then things get done about it. We've got people thinking about the food supply, which we didn't have before. Organizations like Mountain Roots, I think, are vitally important. The food bank. I'm not devoid of hope at all. 50 years in the valley have made me realize that there are a lot of things I didn't even see when I first came that I see now, and probably have been contributing to for most of the last half century. But I'm starting to take personal steps to try to address that, even though I did drive over here today because I've got to go to the grocery store and a couple of other places. But plus, I'm getting too old to ride my bicycle on streets that still have snow. And
It's okay. It's okay. You can.
no, it's not okay. It's not okay to drive to places just because I still can. But eventually, everybody's going to have to come to the realization that we can't be driving down the street to the store. And
Well, for my part, having been here not nearly as long as you, but a while.
yeah,
1992 is when I arrived.
yeah,
Um,
been here a
this-
quarter century.
yeah, this community has a lot of those things that you've just described going on, and I find hope in that.
Yeah,
George, thanks for joining me today. Awesome
Yeah.
conversation.
yeah. I thank you, Alan, and thanks for doing this. I haven't caught up completely on ThinkRadio, but I'm getting there.
Good.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper.
Think Radio is a production of Alan Wardis Media. The show's executive producer is Issa Forrest. Associate producer, Kat Seibert. Original music by Issa Forrest. New episodes are available for download every Monday morning on iTunes and at alanwardismedia.com. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Think Radio.